Here we are with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Got my coffee cup here. Got my coffee drink. We have a great guest. I'm Eddie Moore Jr. He, him, and his, founder of the White Privilege Conference. And today we're with Shelly Tochluk. Shelly, we designed Coffee Talks as a way to introduce people in the WPC family, the WPC network, to each other better. So let's get started. Who is Shelly? What do you do?
I live in Los Angeles. What I do actually is, for paid work, is I'm an educator. I am a professor at Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles. I am currently the co-director of the Liberal Studies program, which means I work with predominantly young women of color who are intending to become teachers. I also teach some grad students, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I do a lot of the time. But my background is in psychology and have always loved that field. And what that's done for me is it offered me an opportunity as I went through my educational process to do a lot of deep self-reflection. It was in doing that reflection because of pressure. I'm going to say pressure from folks external to me who were like, you know what, you actually have some things to think about, particularly in terms of race and class. That started in about, I'd say about 1995 when I was a school teacher in Inglewood, California. That is a heavily Black and brown community. It was during a time period where it was shifting from being a predominantly Black community to being predominantly Latinx. And that started my journey. And it took about maybe 5 years or so to start putting it into a study as opposed to just personally navigating. And once I started studying it as part of my doctoral dissertation, because I really needed to figure myself out by that point, it was actually that process that led me to WPC. My first time at WPC was 2005, while I was actually finishing up a dissertation on basically what did it mean for me as a white person to be in the world, both in terms of identity process, in terms of responsibility. Out of that dissertation came Witnessing Whiteness. And that's the book that probably, for the people who know who I am, it's because of that book. Yeah, so I've continued to speak on that for, when required and when people want. So that's a good enough start, I think.
Yeah, that's really good. I want to ask you what that means, witnessing whiteness. First, though, can you just define what whiteness is and how one witnesses whiteness?
Yeah, so one of the things that my colleague Christine Saxman has really helped me understand is the importance of separating out sort of white culture, whiteness, and white people. So whiteness, I think, is referring to the systemic nature of our entire hundreds of years long history that has created advantage out of being a white person. By law, by politics, by sociocultural, everything. And so whiteness is both the system, and then it's kind of become very much tied to cultural attitudes and approaches that end up being able to characterize a lot of typical white behaviors, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I want to say more, because in terms of witnessing whiteness, so this is, I always ask people that when I would do workshops too, like when you think of the idea of witnessing, what comes to mind? Because a lot of people think, to bear witness. They come from a religious context. I'm like, okay, that's cool, nothing wrong with that. For me, what I meant when I called the book Witnessing Whiteness was out of an understanding that, when a trauma occurs, and understand, I was thinking probably very individualistically at the time in terms of interpersonal racism, to be totally honest. And at the time I was thinking, okay, when a trauma occurs, right, there is, the agent of the trauma, there's the victim there, and then there are like bystanders and, witnesses. And so what's the difference between a bystander position and a witness position? And I was looking at myself as someone who had grown up not within an overtly, explicitly racist context, but definitely one who had all of kind of covert stuff going on, and realizing I had been a bystander for so long, thinking that just because I didn't see myself as a perpetrator in overt intentional ways, that was cool. Like I had no other work to do. So waking up to realizing that I needed to become a witness, like what does it take to be a witness, right? So what it takes to be a witness, and I think of that as that idea of like taking the stand in kind of a court case kind of situation. If you're going to be a decent witness, you need to be able to understand what you saw, what's happening, what is it that's going on that you can stand up, do something active to say, I see what happened and I want to call it to account in order for justice to be done. So when I say witnessing whiteness, that's what I've always meant, is developing the capacity to notice and name the transgressions that occur so that we can do something, take responsibility for shifting it.
Yeah, so I want to ask you how long in your experience of doing this and working around this topic over the years, you feel it takes a person to really be able to not only grasp that understanding of witness, but to be comfortable, to be really skillful at actually participating in that witness. All right,
Yeah.
that witnessing, I should say. What does it take? What does that journey take? But first, let me ask you, did you grow up thinking someday I'm gonna be writing about witnessing whiteness, you know, doing talks and doing trainings? I mean, how did you get to this point?
Okay, two really different questions. I'll start with that. I'll start with that second one. No. Short answer, no. I had no idea. It wasn't until I was 25 years old that I was asked to see myself as a person who was white, and that was a meaningful thing. I absolutely was raised, like many, many other white people, to see myself as an individual. Sure, I maybe happened to be white, but I was not at all taught to consider that there was any kind of group experience around that or group responsibility around that. So the answer is no. I will tell you that one of the more impactful moments in my life, though, was I started taking this stuff seriously because I really cared about some people of color in my life, and I really cared what they thought of me. And honestly, it was having personal relationships that created the investment for me to go through the challenge of looking at myself more deeply. I did not want to lose those relationships. So where I sit in my experience is often different than many of the people that we collectively are trying to influence, because I wasn't sitting in a predominantly white community at 25 years old being told I needed to care about people who weren't immediately in my life. I was having day-to-day experiences predominantly with people of color. By then I was mad at kind of the world, but I didn't really know what to think and do about it. But I remember very, very specifically going to a community nonprofit, speaking to, one of the staff members who was sitting at the front desk one day. And, this question had come up, I think, because keep in mind, I was brought into this conversation without ever hearing the word white privilege. No one was talking systems. It was just about actions and behaviors. It was the details we were talking about. We didn't have any names for it that we were using with each other. And then I heard this thing called a white ally. I said, I don't know what that means. And I did two things about that time. I went to this Black woman and I said, have you ever heard of this thing called a white ally? And she said, what does it mean? And she said, well, it's basically a white anti-racist activist. And I went, oh shit, because number one, I was not a politically oriented person at the time. So the idea of becoming an activist scared the bejesus out of me, I'll just say. And I didn't really understand what anti-racism was except for a thought process. What I do know is that I went to a whole bunch of white people around the same time. And I said, have you heard of this thing called a white ally? And no, the answer was no. Now, this was back in, early 2000s. This was before a lot of the conversation was going mainstream. But that was one of my first wake up moments to be like, oh, okay, I am really deeply afraid of this. And I've said this before to a lot of people, but I am sure that she said this to me a number of times in my relationship with her. But there was one particular moment around this time where she said to me, Shelly, I like you. I'm glad you're here and I appreciate you. But we got this. Like, we're working for our community and we can do this. What we need is for you to go work with other white people. And that also scared me, because I would have rather, it was easier to try to fit into this community of color who seemed perfectly happy to have me there. And then I could sit on my high horse thinking I was doing something good. When what I was told was, no, you got to go confront your home community who did not have any idea what I was talking about. So I'll bridge that to your second question about how did I come to, how long does it take? A long time for me. I think there are some people I know who it's like a light switch turns on, where something in their life has allowed them to put the pieces together and start to move very quickly and do so with skill. For me, it took a very, very long time. It took me, I was speaking to groups of 400 people before I had the courage to speak to my grandmother and skill to speak to my grandmother, for example. But I also had just a lot to work through. And it was actually the WPC once. Do you remember back when WPC used to have a lot more grassroots activist folks showing up? Yeah. And there was like a Saturday sort of like a retreat coming together where all the white activists would get in a room and hash things out. Yeah. And this was way back in like 2006, 2007, something like that. So I was there at that time and I was like fly on the wall. Again, this was all around that time. I didn't have a sense of myself as an activist, but I just wanted to become more present so I could learn. And I remember watching a debate between the founder of Aware LA and another prominent activist from the Bay Area. And they were going back and forth about the different approaches to base building for white anti-racists. And it went something like, well, our program is going to like move people through in 6 months. Your program is going to take too long. And then the Aware founder was like, yeah, but we need everybody. So it might need to take more time, but we need to do it. Like, yeah, but we don't have that kind of time. This is, consenting and coddling privilege. It's like, but we need everybody. And I remember just seeing it. And I remember thinking, dang, like I wasn't ready in 6 months. I barely feel ready now. But, maybe there's some people who can go fast and they'll find the programming that goes fast. And maybe there's some people who take a slower way for whatever reason. And I'll work with them, because it took me a long time. That was just even to get my mind wrapped around it, much less the actual skills to effectively pull somebody in without just doing the feel good, I'm just going to shut you down and then push you away from it. Because for me, all of it has been about what's strategically useful. Like, what is it that is going to help me pull somebody in, keep them hanging out with white folks so that we're the ones who have to navigate the ineffectual, kind of statements until we get people prepared to do more multiracial organizing out there. So that's some of what I've been doing.
Yeah, and with all your experience with LA, Aware, and at the university, I mean, all the things you've been doing, I'm wondering, what's your sense of the state of white America in reference to social justice, being allies, willing and ready to do the work within white America around these issues? I know it's hard to do a sweeping analysis, but you've had several years of experience and you've been grappling day to day inside that world with some great folks. And I'm wondering, just how would you describe the state of white America when it comes to pursuing social justice, becoming anti-racist allies, whatever that word, whatever those terms are?
Yeah. Honestly, I feel like it's both the best and the worst right now, you know? I mean, I to speak to the worst part of it for just a second, I was so impacted by Carol Anderson's book, White Rage. For those of you who have not read that book, I highly, highly recommend it. It's a Black female historian who writes basically about like 5 different, I mean, each chapter is just a full pendulum shift. Thank you. Full pendulum shift of at every point where there has been advancement among the Black community, there's been absolute deep and prolonged pushback by white America. We're in the heart of that kind of pushback, right? I mean, this is like chapter 6 writing itself. And it's deeply, deeply, deeply upsetting. It's fear-inducing for me. We can get into that later, because I've been looking real closely at what that's inviting right now. And so that, on one hand, we're in a deep hole of that in terms of white people who are getting pulled into a reactive stance, right? That's true, that's real, and that is horrifying. And we're at a time where, for the last 15 years, there's been an absolute, expansion of white people who are having this conversation on a regular basis, that are picking sides and picking the side of justice, and recognizing the importance of paying attention to race, recognizing that they're part of a thing that's bigger than them, and joining with people to start to pay attention to it. That's tremendously hopeful, right? And so, I mean, Surge National, showing up for racial justice started, it started in earnest before, Michael Brown's killing, but it really radically expanded outside of that and after that. And there are chapters, I think at my last count, and this is old data, but years ago, there were already over 100, probably 140 chapters across the United States. They come and go, some are stronger than others, but we're talking about white people coming together with other white people to organize and work in solidarity with people of color on the ground. There's a lot of good work that comes out of there, that's sort of, there's faith group offerings, and there's some consciousness building in terms of political action, and all of that is really heartening. There's more educational opportunities than I think we've ever seen. Back in 2005 at WPC, when you were offering White Caucus, like that was something that people were not at all sure was a good idea. And that was, 15 years ago. And there's still a large part of the populace for whom it's really weird and really strange and doesn't make any sense at all. And that's understandable, because we don't have a good history of white people getting in rooms together and coming out with something real great, and I always say this, like that work of white caucusing, that work of white people working with white people, to me is always a matter of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Always. There's always a 1 step back that's part of that. It is imperfect for all kinds of reasons. But just to wrap this part up, I think that, what I've seen in the evolution of this work over the last, maybe let's say 10 years, is a lot more people embracing that idea that it's white people's job to work with other white people so that we can get ourselves straight to do less damage in the world. Just in the last week and a half, as I walk in my neighborhood with my mask on, with the dog, coming into contact with neighbors, yeah, they know who I am. Yeah, they know what I do, but they're the ones who have started initiating this conversation, saying, you know what? Hey, I'm watching this go on. And one particular neighbor just less than a week ago said, I was thinking, and this is a white neighbor, I was thinking about this and I was watching what's been going on, and like, I'm trying to put words to it. And I didn't really understand what, this just feels wrong. Like there's things wrong that's happening, with all these disparities. And she said, and then I read like my friend's dad, he wrote this article and he's like the most brilliant person in the entire world. And you know what he said this is? And it's exactly right. It's institutional racism. That's the term. And I was like, it's like she was discovering it for the first time. And, and that's on her own, just watching the world. And those are the moments that I find hopeful.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you about that old Marvin Gaye song, What's Going On? Your perspective in reference to COVID-19, what you're seeing in LA, but also as someone who's been doing this work over the years, just what's resonating for you as you think about where we are now, where we've come from, where we are now, and thinking about moving ahead. But before that, I want to ask you this question that I think is really important as well around white people doing social justice work. Because what I found, and I think we can all agree that sometimes white people say it, it's received differently than when I say it. And sometimes that can be really good in a strategic way, but sometimes it can be quite lucrative. And so my question for you is, in your experience, as you look at the expanding of white participation in social justice work, my question is it justice that's inspiring that or revenue? And another book I have here to conquer over my summer reading is Diversity Incorporated, which really speaks to the billion-dollar business of diversity work. So just give me some of your thoughts around that in reference to revenue or justice.
I mean, there's a both and to be talked about on this one. It is a conundrum. I want to call it, it's a conundrum that people have been navigating since way before I was paying attention to this stuff. There was even a workshop at WPC years ago, I remember, that asked this very question. And I was in the room with a whole bunch of people, you know, challenging each other to try to find a way through. I will say that from my little perch within this work, most of the people I'm interacting with on a regular basis are not doing this for work, for money. So, you know, I've still got I got my full-time job, you know, everything I'm doing is, most of the hours I'm putting in is not for money. A lot of people I know are doing a lot of work that's not for money. And I know people and love people who are some of my best friends who are full-time diversity consultants, right? So I see both ends of that spectrum. For me, what happened is that I was listening. I was listening to a lot of folks. I know there are some people who take the strong stance that I will not read anything by a white person because I don't want any money going to a white person. I'm not going to listen to any of white people. I'm only going to listen to folks of color, and I'm only going to uplift folks of color. And I mean, that's a stance, you know. I think I might have even existed in that stance for a little while. And then there were other people, some folks of color, who were like, you know, don't do it all for free because then it makes people feel like they shouldn't pay me to do it. Right. You know, and there's folks of color who need to be doing this work to get that work out there. And so, you know, that was part of it. And there's also a part where I'm not as skillful as I would be if I were doing it full time. I want to be clear about that. There is probably a different path of my life where if I had a decade ago decided to go full time doing this work, I could have made a much stronger impact with a lot more people. I would have gotten checked and challenged in a different kind of way. I would have honed my vocabulary and skills probably faster, and it would have gone further. And so for the people who have gone in that direction, and I'm still in touch with many people where I can watch it happening. I've seen people progress farther than me in their ability to, in the moment, recognize what's going on, name what's going on, and push people through. That skill is valuable. And the fact is they need to have a roof over their head and they need to eat too. So if you're trying to talk about what's enough money, you know, but we live in a capitalist society where unless we're going to be 100% off grid, we're going to have to grapple with that aspect of resources. So I don't bemoan people who have decided to go full time because I value what they're doing for our society. At the same time, my position is doing a lot more of the volunteerism and activist work. But I don't think put that on a scale of being better than or making a better choice than. If there's any piece I've written that I'm most proud of, it's a medium piece. It takes 12 minutes to read it, and it's called On Ramps and Lanes on the Racial Justice Freeway. And the main argument is that this work is too important for us to pick at each other. It's too important for us within our collective of people who care to become the enemy of each other. There is plenty of enemy that are not trying to further this work. So whether you're in the slow lane or the paid lane or the organizing lane, all of it to me is important. And because I sit so strongly there, that's my answer is I'm not gonna criticize.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that. I really think that there has to be, and we're trying to do it at WPC, just some ongoing conversation about this, because it's also even, I think, some conversation that needs to happen between people of color around, what the work even is. What are we talking about when we talk about doing diversity work? Should it include whiteness and white supremacy and all? I mean, I think there's so much more ahead of us around this work, because the last 25 years has been a buildup of opportunity and possibilities, but whether we're making a difference and then how we move forward, I think has all changed with the pandemic. Speaking of the pandemic, I want to ask you about what is going on in your mind when you look at the state of affairs today. I mean, in the old song of Marvin Gaye, what's going on? If you had to describe this time to somebody 25 years from now, how would you describe what's going on now? What are you seeing around you? What are you seeing in your community, in LA at large? I mean, what's going on, and what is this pandemic telling us about our society today from your perspective?
So there's so many layers, a lot of different tracks to go on that. Let me see if I can track this and pull me back in. I'm going to start super local, and then kind of to our racial justice conversation, and then a little bit of a global thing. Super local, I see operating around me, a brilliance of mutual aid societies showing up for each other. I see people who are volunteering to deliver food in ways that are socially just oriented, in ways that I hadn't seen happening before. So I see some beauty. I see Black Lives Matter activists connected with white people for Black lives who are pushing for people to be released from jails, calling the mayor of LA to account for his budget that's trying to push more funding toward the police as opposed to more for, community support. We just came off of a really big campaign that was all about trying to stop $3-point-something billion heading into the jails. And so I see a lot of mobilization in Los Angeles. We also have awful housing crisis. We also see disparities of people who are suffering and dying. And because we're LA, yes, the disparities of Black people being a higher percentage than white is absolutely in existence, but we also have an extremely high number of Latinx folks. And cannot leave them out of the equation here, because in LA, the essential workers are Black and brown, and are obviously getting sicker more than others. Asian and white populations here in LA also are more able to stay at home and do work. All of that stuff is leading to that second layer, which is we in LA are experiencing the exact same disparities that we're seeing nationwide, which are wholly, if you're paying any attention whatsoever, predictable. That doesn't make it any harder to take in the heart. But the disparities that we have in this United States are only being exacerbated by COVID in every single marker. And so, we can look and read and listen and see what all the reasons for how that's happening, and just today doing some education on myself and why is that disparity occurring, and got it little notes right in front of me, just not because we were talking, but just because I was taking notes while I was listening to a podcast walking this morning, right? I mean, the people who have been in most proximal touch with each other to spread, to then have, overall systemic healthcare challenges, who have been experiencing environmental racism for, all of their lives, which result in having underlying health conditions, and then having the fact that, people, mostly Black and brown folks here in LA, who have been suffering from, discrimination, adverse effects, which is a history of then, the weathering on the body. That's the term that I just learned today, the weathering on the body that happens for folks of color through an entire lifetime, right? So all of that stuff is magnified, just absolutely magnified. So that, I mean, I'm seeing that. I'm seeing it in terms of responses to it. I will say I'm at least grateful that it is the top line of what's in the newspaper. At least people are talking about it and not trying to push it under the covers or under the rug. That's, I think, important. Whether or not there's I mean, let's just let go of the governmental action part on it. I mean, I think from the federal level, it's not coming. There's been some state action in California that's trying to name this and address it. Can't speak too much to it specifically, but when you say that big line, what's going on, like all of that seems like the basic stuff, to be totally honest. All that seems the basic stuff. The big, like, global what's going on is multiple global crises all happening at the same time, right? And having this particular pandemic being top of mind, but we also have the climate crisis. Both of these things are going to be pushing people to move from the places where they have been. The wealth inequality is a huge issue. Take all three of those combined, and people are moving into some desperate times, right? And all of that would be bad enough. All of that would be bad enough. A global pandemic plus wealth inequality, both globally and within the United States, and now a pandemic putting people out of work, making people whose lives were already on the verge and on edge. And as we know, people of color end up taking the economic hit more than white people. I'm saying all this stuff you already know, Eddie. I know this, but the fourth piece to add to it is the fact that we're also in a time where there's a global rise in white supremacy. And so as white supremacists are actively recruiting to get people to actively fear people of color and raising all of their calls to be fearful of people who are in crisis, especially people of color who are going to be disproportionately in crisis, there's some fear that arises in me from our both national and global potential that we're going to need to get out in front of.
Yeah, part of why I asked you about the state of white America, particularly around social justice, is connected to the point you just made, because I feel like if I ask white supremacists how they're doing, I feel like they're going to be feeling like they've had some pretty good years over these last few years. And it just, I think, gives us reason to pause as those of us who are doing work around social justice to think that the people that we've often been pushing against and challenging and being challenged by are feeling pretty enthusiastic about the future. And so I just want to ask you, if you had a chance to do a small little PSA, a public service announcement to white folks about the time we're in, about the things that are needed during this time. And I'm not talking about the people who are resistors. I'm saying the folks who want to be watching this to learn some stuff and be inspired by this. What's your inspirational message to white folks about this time in reference to what's needed as we look at, let's just say, the next 25 years?
Oh, dang. For people who care about white anti-racism for the next 25 years, my PSA, and this is uniquely me because I don't hear enough of it. I know there's others, but I don't hear enough of it, is that we need to pull together and support any and all of us who are of goodwill trying to fight this battle together. We are going to need to shift from making the enemy the person who's next a little bit right from us, and recognize that there really is a big enemy going on, that we are going to need our recruitment efforts, our outreach efforts, our community building efforts to allow for people to be imperfect. Yes, we're going to need to call people in. Yes, we're going to need to offer the critique. Yes, we're going to need to continue to build everybody's analysis. And we're going to have to do that in a way that allows for joy, that allows for even white people to adopt a sense of this being liberating, for there to be a community spirit around it, because we are losing the politically informed. People are looking around and being influenced by the argument that the activist class, the left, the social justice warriors are only going to beat you down. And if we replicate the beating down part, then we are only fueling people to reject what we're offering. And so our offering has to be precise, it needs to be just, and it also needs to make room for all of us in that final collective liberation that we so desperately need and want. I can get scary for people. It's hard for me to offer a lot of inspiration because I know how challenging all of this really is. And I will tell you honestly, Eddie, I've spent the last 10 years doing what a lot of other white anti-racist people have been doing, which is, okay, I've been learning so much. Let me reach back to the people who are just like me and try to pull them forward. That's important work. And I'm not saying that work doesn't need to be done. It absolutely needs to be done. Keep doing it. And if we don't also take a broader look and look at the scary, scary part, because most people are too scared to look at the far right, too scared to look at the way that the alt-right is having a very good time right now, then we are susceptible to allowing what I do think is dangerous, for there to be no distinction made between white supremacy culture, which is largely unconscious, and avowed conscious white supremacists. They're not the exact same thing. And when we use language that makes it exactly the same thing, we lose too many people in the middle ground who aren't ready to understand the nuance.
Yeah. Can you first tell us where we can read more about what you're doing, find you, and some of the work that you've been doing, and also what's on the horizon as you look at the next 10 years? Are there other things you're working on, other things you're excited about? Give us a sense of how to find you and what's on the horizon.
So I'm altogether too easy to find because I work at Mount St. Mary's University and I'm a faculty member there. So that means my email is findable. There's also a website, shellytochluk.com. The only trouble is spelling my last name. So if you can spell my last name, you can find me. Shellytochluk.com is easy. I put out a newsletter every single month. First of the month, it offers a curated set of what I've been exposed to that feels really important out in the world. And responding to that directly gets to me as well. So all the issues on, the disparities of COVID I've been highlighting a bunch of that stuff. I've also been highlighting this issue around the alt-right, white nationalists and their rise. I've been spending about a year highlighting a lot of that stuff. All the past issues are available. So that's really highlighting other voices. In terms of me, there are a few pieces that are on Medium. So if you look up my name on medium.com, there are a few pieces I think that would really kind of catch you up. One that was especially important as we go into this election cycle. It's called My Day with the Far Right. I learned a hell of a lot by going to this far right conservative Christian conference that I think is important for people to potentially know about. Christine Saxman and I produced about a year ago, just in time for WPC, something called Swastikas in the Bathroom, connecting the dots between the, white supremacists, white nationalists, the alt-right, the light right, which I had never heard of. That's more of a resource document. It's annotated, so you can get to all the sources from there. So really what I'm looking at trying to do is be a curator and kind of advancer of the knowledge that I come into contact with, because a lot of this is new for me. I am in a learning mode, just like everybody else on this. I don't consider myself an expert. I just care a hell of a lot. In terms of what's on my horizon, there are some things going on that I'm trying to do some partnership work that's too early to tell, but I'm definitely trying to be part of the production of some resource tools that are going to be useful for parents and teachers on how to talk to kids to help inoculate them against indoctrination from the far right. So that's kind of pressing for me right now. Also, Aware LA is a great resource. A couple of important things. So Aware LA, you should look it up, awarela.org. If you're a white person who is interested in doing this work in your home community, a couple of resources to know about. Aware LA has got a toolkit for white anti-racist culture building. We have produced and this is all free, all the resources that we use to host our Saturday dialogues, which is white people coming together to do the personal consciousness raising work. We've been active for 16 and a half years without stop. So all that information is there. I help to produce that. If that is too far ahead and that may be second step, but you need a first step, cool, that's fine. We got that too. Just be in touch with me. I got a first step to get you ready for the second step. We got you covered. That's also free. Witnessing Whiteness, the book. Also, there's a fully free curriculum you can do just to get folks together. You got 5 people, you got 10 people in your community, you got 2 people, you got you and your best buddy who are quarantined together. You want to read this book, share in the curriculum, have the dialogue. That sets you up to be able to use the bigger resources. And then there's just a lot. There's a lot more. I'm going to stop there because I could go on and on and on. Yeah. But the point is, for white people, there is no shortage of resources. No shortage, whether it's mine or other people's, no shortage.
Well, you sparked a question for me to ask you. If you were talking to parents, based on all you've learned up to this moment around white nationalists, white supremacists, and their recruitment, what would be a quick message to parents to be looking out for, especially as we come about or get ready to come into the summer where kids may have a little more time at home and communities? I mean, how are these folks active? What's your message to parents?
Okay, so that's an hour-and-a-half long thing, but I'm going to do it in 30 seconds because here's the thing. Not only are kids more at home, but we are talking about kids spending all their time online, which is exceedingly dangerous because there's one whole set of folks that we're usually thinking about, like the KKK, the people with the guns type of white supremacists. But we need to watch out for those pseudo-academic kind of making the academic arguments and doing a whole lot of really nasty stuff online. And so all the platforms, this is not about banning your kids from being on any particular social media platform, but it is about building the kind of relationship with your child where that you are actually having the conversation about what they're seeing and how they're interpreting it. Because there's a lot going on online that has a whole series of steps that leads right back to white nationalists and their talking points and the way that they are getting manifested into mainstream. So a couple of key points. Number one, get comfortable talking to your child about what they're seeing. Ask to see their social media phones, or their phones to figure out who are their avatars, what do they want, what YouTube people are they following, what Twitter people are they following, on Instagram, who are they following, what are they liking, why are they liking it, what do they think that means, because there's a lot to watch out for. In terms of what's available, Two resources. This will be quick. Two resources to look up. One of them is a New York Times piece. It came out and kind of went viral last September by a woman named Joanna Schroeder. This opinion piece came out in the New York Times. It is fantastic, and it's called Racists Are Recruiting. Watch out for your white sons. And what it does that's most essential, I mean, grab it, it's only 4 pages, but it also talks about the way she, as a parent of young white children, is engaging with her kids in order to build a relationship with them, that they're the co-conspirators. They're the ones who are revealing the manipulation, so that she becomes a resource to break down all these messages, because kids left to their own devices aren't necessarily coming up with the important insights into what's going on. So that's number one. There's another piece I strongly recommend people picking up that is from the Washingtonian. It's earlier, and it's like what happened when my 13-year-old got pulled into the far right. And hit me up if you can't find it, because I've got these resources. But the reason that particular piece is the most powerful thing that I have read is because this parent had her white child get completely drawn in, didn't realize it until too late. And it's the way that she maintained relationship and what she learned in rebuilding the relationship with that child that helped him get pulled back. Deeply important, deeply important. A lot of insights in there for all of us. Teachers too should be reading that one. The most recent thing coming out, that if you just want, like, okay, I don't have any idea of this, you're freaking me out a little bit, how do I kind of get caught up? There's a new podcast by the New York Times called Rabbit Hole. Only 6 episodes have come out so far, but it really lays out how the social media platforms are operationalizing the conveyor belt descent into the far right. Lot of deep insight into that. Really, really good work being done. So Rabbit Hole as a podcast. It picks up on the story that was highlighted in last June, about a kid named Caleb Kane, who was a white kind of liberal kid who ended up a college dropout, went down this rabbit hole into the far right. And yeah, that's good stuff.
I just got to ask you this, because I feel like much of the work around white supremacists, alt-right, the recruitment efforts is towards white boys. And you spent some time inside one of these recruitment events or organizing events. I mean, what is the role of white women, white girls, and are they a part of this? And is there something different that parents should be doing who have young daughters?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple pieces of that. It would actually be easier if they were only recruiting white boys. That's absolutely the majority, for sure. White young women are recruited in. There's some really good stuff that just came out very recently. A young woman named Samantha. If you look up some keywords, Google Samantha, white woman, white nationalist, and the keyword there is identity Europa, and Europa is Evropa, identity Europa, a young woman who actually left the movement and has a lot to say about it. So a couple of ways in for young girls to watch out for. Most of the young women who end up in the movement, and this is what I'm just learning this myself, come in via relationships. So, watch the girls in terms of their own self-esteem and what they expect from a good relationship. Some girls do show up because white nationalists do have a very strong sense of what might be typically considered that conservative orientation toward family. So those strong gender roles. So some young women who actually like the idea of being just a stay-at-home mom, and I'm gonna, be part of this Western civilization upkeep, and I'm just gonna have babies, probably a little bit more susceptible if they have that idea already. But then some girls really love being the cool chick. I mean, they stand out. Young women in the movement stand out, right? They're kind of a prize in the movement. And so it can be attractive at the start. Again, usually brought in by a relationship. When the relationship fails, the women are more likely to leave, and or if the girls end up taking up that cool chick mantle and then start to be their own like YouTube pundits or something like that, then they get a bit more powerful. They get a little bit more, ego around it, and that feels good. But then they're going to deal with the misogyny in it. And so that can be uncomfortable and can help push them out too. So, I would suggest both for the boys and for the girls, it's really about a parent learning enough to be able to help their kids understand, look, there's manipulation happening here. Don't get drawn into it. You're not stupid. You're not stupid. You don't have to fall for this, because that's the language they're using. The white nationalist folks and an entire set of the far right are really using this kind of messaging that is telling young kids that they are being condescended to by their parents and by liberal teachers, an entire educational system that won't let them think for themselves. And that's my primary concern, is we've got kids 9 to 11 to 13, even before they end up at a school that's doing a diversity, equity, inclusion program, have already got kids kind of inoculated against that program by giving them language that undercuts it before we adults even know what's going on. Yeah. That's why we have to really get on board with this. But here's the thing, Eddie, is that this whole relationship between the far right and this alt-light situation, which is this whole set of really misogynistic, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, they may not racialize it, but it's deeply hateful. And there's actually probably far more of it even than the white nationalism piece of it. But that's the conveyor belt I'm super worried about, because they're also pulling kids of color in. Yeah. And they absolutely use the small minority of kids of color or people, right? Because it's adults too. But when people of color get into that zone, then they become magnified as, see, we're not a problem. We're not racially problematic, because how could you say that? It's like there's some key examples of people who stand up on stages as, Black people, Asian people, gay people, who are, speaking these hateful things, and they think they're going to be safe in this. They're not either. But
yeah, well, that's another area I think where we need additional work and research and conversation and time, but we don't have it. It's just the role of, as I've been saying it, Black white supremacists, but definitely just people of color or marginalized groups participating in uplifting these folks as inclusive hate mongers. But we'll have to maybe bring you and Christine. I had Brother Christian also on, and maybe we'll do a live show around some of the work y'all have been doing and some of the work y'all got upcoming around really equipping parents, educators, community leaders around not only what white supremacists alt-right look like, but also their activity around our young people. But I got to let you go. I appreciate your time, Shelly Tochluk. You have been supporting me and the conference for years, and we appreciate that. And if we can continue to collaborate with you in any way, let us know. And thank you for the knowledge and for also just sharing how you came about your journey. And we look forward to staying in touch.
Well, thank you. WPC has been my incubation for growth. It is where annually I have gotten rejuvenated. It is the place that has sustained me and helped me make the relationships that keep me going all year long. So thank you for all of what you have provided for all of us. I do not think the white anti-racist movement would be what it is without your leadership in pulling us all together and helping us stay focused. Thank you.
Appreciate you. Much love.
Much love.
Linda.
Yeah. Quarantine hugs.
Quarantine hugs. All right, sis. Be safe out there in LA.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Peace.